Welcome to Conversations, Lehman College's series of discussions with major theater and musical figures of our time. For the second of a two-part chat, our guest today is the brilliantly gifted composer and librettist, Mark Adamo. Welcome again to Conversations, Mark.
Great to be back. You haven't changed a bit.
When last we spoke, we were talking about your creative process during the composition of Lysistrata, and the piece we just saw, a beautiful section, the ending of Act One, where the women of Athens and Sparta are fighting with resisting the Athenian men and Spartan men in their quest for peace. What was essentially your creative process like?
Well, this actually began when I was doing Little Women. I mean, the thing that with both of these operas that was so daunting is, you know, a short opera is 2 hours, whereas a big string quartet is 40 minutes. I mean, the sheer size of it and the complexity of it, and also the fact that you really want an opera, unlike, say, a musical, to feel like the music and the language are driving it equally, without one dragging the other along, made me think, how do I sketch this out in a way that is not prematurely bound to either words or music, but you can still talk with some specificity about what the big shape of the evening, as well as the small details, are going to be. And so what it occurred to me to do was to make actually an acting outline. It was based a little bit on my reading of Uta Hagen's textbook Respect for Acting, in which she described her process of marking just a role in a play as a design of actions. What does this character want in an overarching sense? What does she want in this scene? What does she want what is she doing with each of these lines
and
to
what
accomplish?
Is the resistance to it?
Precisely.
So
precisely.
You generate the drama from the resistance.
Exactly. And she called
action.
that document her acting score, which I found very interesting. And so it occurred to me maybe I could write the acting score first, and then the libretto and the musical score thereafter, and then I would always know, among other things, that the piece would be actable, and then both the music and the theater would pertain to it.
One can see your playwriting roots and your theatrical roots that it shows, and your works are very dramatic. Lysistrata is your second opera.
Yes.
You rose to national operatic attention with your first opera, Little Women, which was also premiered by the Houston Grand Opera and then went on to the New York City Opera, among a million other places. It's now played all over the world.
Pretty much. We've been to Mexico City,
You really
we've been
made
to Tokyo.
a tremendous splash with this opera. Before we go any farther, I thought we should hear a glorious section of it with all four of Little Women's sisters, Louisa May Alcott's sisters, singing the Houston Grand Opera version that was broadcast on PBS. Can we roll that? beautiful. How did that go over in Tokyo?
Beautifully. It's an interesting question, because that was my question about bringing a piece in English that's so associated with America to an Asian audience. Although the thing that I did not know was that the book is the first book that you read entirely in English in the Japanese school system. If you, it's the first piece. You know, if you take English as a second language and you get to a point where you are reading English literature, that's the piece with which you begin. Because in certain ways, and I didn't know this either, the struggle to maintain your individuality at the same time that you want to maintain your relationships with your family in a rather formal way is still very much alive with Asian women, which is one of the reasons why the book has been filmed, I think, 3 or 4 times in the past 20 years. There was an anime series on it, under the title Wakakosa Monogatari, which was the first 2 words I learned in Japanese. But it went very, very beautifully, and the thing that surprised me musically, because the orchestral part of this is actually a rare exception where it's quite full and lushly scored, but the orchestral part is really, for the most part, rather underwritten. And a woman came up to me and said that she was so moved by the quietude and by the tone poem aspect of the orchestration. And I kind of blinked, because I'd never thought of this as an orchestral piece principally, being my own librettist and all of that. But then it occurred to me that the Japanese composer that I have heard the most of and admire a great deal, Takemitsu, the orchestra is just wisps and gestures.
Right.
And so, which I had done in this piece, but really for different reasons, to point up the motives, to underscore the rest. But it occurred to me that it probably sounded more like a Japanese piece than I ever intended it to be.
So you had written it in a Japanese style inadvertently.
By accident, precisely.
That's right. What other productions of... now, how many productions have there been? Have you totaled it?
Oh, gosh, we are nearing our 40th engagement.
Now, this in a time where opera hasn't been as popular, supposedly, as in the past, you probably hold a near record.
Actually, according to my publisher and to other people who know these statistics, if I, as my mother used to say, if I had a dime for every time I heard the phrase, this never happens, then I mean, it is very unusual, that it's been embraced not among professional companies, among academic companies, and now it continues, and now internationally. Mexico happened, Asia happened, Australia is happening in 2007. We are being flirted with by Munich. Who knows?
Aside from the sheer beauty of the piece, in every respect, it's a beautiful piece. To what do you attribute this enormous popularity?
I don't really know. I can give you a couple of reasons that account for certain aspects of it. Obviously, the fact that the book is as well known as it is, and yet the opera is in conversation with it, but is kind of a new thing. So I think the experience has been that you might think that you're going in for one experience, and then the opera, to a certain extent, both becomes its own experience and gives you another view on something that you thought you knew. I think to the extent that it's been embraced academically is because it's about people in colleges. They're college age, singers, and so on the one hand the music is quite demanding, and on the other hand emotionally it maps out the terrain that young people know about. Past that, it's really been something of a miracle, because the word of the piece actually began to get around even before the telecast. I mean, I would have associated a lot of this with simply it being on great performances, but we had 3 or 4 productions booked after the premiere, and the revival didn't happen until 2 years later. So I mean, I like to think, here's what I like to think, which is that the fact that it is dramatically built as if it were a play, as if we're a theater audience. I mean, the phrase that I like to use is that the libretto was for Broadway and the score was for Lincoln Center. You know, I really tried to make sure that simply as a dramatic shape, regardless of what the music was, that it would play simply from the acting point of view. This gets back to the outline problem.
Right.
But then when I did another outline and thought, now, if this were just a symphonic piece, if you were hearing it like most of us hear, say, Strauss or Rossini, where you don't have access to the language as immediately because it's not in English, but if you were going to hear it more or less as a symphonic drama that made sense on its own musically, would you be able to do that? And I think that to the extent that it can, certainly the Japanese performance really bears that out, because they didn't have access to the language, and yet somehow it works the way most of our standard repertory works. The music drives it.
Is it another factor in the tremendous success? Is it also the practicality of the piece?
Well, that's true too. You know, a surprise to me was that after a certain large circuit of large opera houses, most of the operatic activity and the most heartening activity, the companies that are building new audiences and doing progressive things, those are the companies that are actually making news in the quote-unquote opera revival of the past 20 years. A lot of these companies actually have very small theaters. And the thing that was my despair in 1998 in scoring this piece was trying to fit this rather substantial music into an 18-player ensemble. But later I found out that a lot of these productions were being done in theaters where they couldn't fit any more than 80 people in the pit. Who knew? You know? And so I think that as time goes on, composers that I know of, actually, who have written their pieces for a standard symphonic ensemble, winds and twos, whatever, more and more they're reducing them for 18, 20 players. I think actually inspired by the Little Women example, because the very companies who would want to be in the vanguard of doing new work are locked out of it for something as dumb, if you will, or at least not artistically based, as the size of their orchestra pit. And I never knew that until I was invited to this or that production around the country and saw the theaters.
I think we should hear another piece of Little Women, which is the aria Kennst du das Land, which is in German,
Yes.
sung by a character who is German,
Yes.
Dr. Bär.
Right.
And Kennst du das Land means, do you know the land?
Mm-hmm.
Another gorgeous piece of lyrical writing.
Thank you.
Can we roll that? Now, that was the Cleveland Lyric Opera's production
Yes.
of this piece, and you directed it.
Guilty as charged.
Guilty.
Yes.
Now you're taking away jobs from directors and the director. And
I have heard that, actually.
yes. So, what prompted you to direct the opera?
Well, the short answer is that it's the only thing that I enjoy nearly as much as composing and writing libretti. You know, the longer answer is that it's kind of the same. It's the same part of the brain from which I wrote it, which goes back a little to what you were asking about. How do you make it? One way of describing those outlines, by which I came up with the book and the score, is directing the show before it's written. You know, because
right.
if you're giving the actors, you know, actions which you are then making unmissable, you hope, in both the book and the score, then I remember very, very clearly my frustration once we got into rehearsal for the Houston premiere. that after a certain point, you really weren't welcome in rehearsal because the director and the performers needed to put it together without the writer breathing, breathing down their necks. Because no matter how nice you are, no matter how many brownies you bring to the first rehearsal, you as the writer are going to make people nervous while they are stumbling over words and notes and trying to figure out their blocking. But that, of course, that's where all the fun began to me, because rehearsal, actually putting it together, in human bodies in space. That's why you do all of this, to get the kind of magic that you can't get necessarily if you're making a record or making a film. And so I always thought that wouldn't it be lovely to direct this piece or other pieces, because I had directed some Sondheim and Menotti and Britten and whatnot in my previous life in Washington. And then Lyric Opera Cleveland was going to do this production, and I just floated the trial balloon out there if they would be interested in me doing it, and they jumped at it, and we had a great time. It was thrilling. And among other things, I appreciated all the good work that every other director had done with this piece, and it stopped me from saying something that I had been saying for the previous 7 years, which is, it's really not a hard piece to do. It's actually a rather difficult piece to do. It doesn't have to be an expensive piece to do, which is partly what I was meaning, but there are certain scenes where they've been done one way by every other director whom I have seen stage it, and that's exactly the way that I did it, because I couldn't find another way to do it either. Act 1, Scene 2, it's a cuckoo clock. It's a lunatic scene.
Now that you have made your directing debut, do you have any desire to direct the work of other?
I do, actually. Like?
Yeah.
Oh, I would actually like to try Candide.
Candide.
I don't know. It's one of those problem pieces that every director thinks, oh well, I can solve it, and I'm no exception. I do think I can solve it, and at least I haven't seen a failed production that has failed in the way that mine will fail. Cancel. But that sort of thing. I have some thoughts about Salome. I actually have some thoughts about Carmen, of all things, if anyone's going to trust me with a repertory piece. Yeah, it's a slim folio. I'd love to do your piece, but of course your piece, with any luck, will not be suffering from lack of attention anytime soon.
From your mouth to God's ear.
Yes. Well, little birds are
so we hear.
Spreading rumors. Yes.
So we hear.
We'd get along very well,
I understand. I think it would be interesting. I think it would be interesting. In an interview in Opera Today, you say you're optimistic about the future of opera in America.
I am. I'm optimistic.
Why?
Well, because...
How can you say that?
I know. Well, I'm optimistic to the extent that we are undergoing a really interesting crisis at the moment. Do you know? The bad news is that the way opera houses have worked in this country, which has been museums of performance in which antique and foreign pieces have been used principally as coat hangers on which to hang the performance of this year's mezzo-soprano. That whole paradigm is breaking down. And so, you will have enormous opera houses doing repertory pieces with international stars, and they are still papering Saturday night houses. The good news is that was always a bad idea to do opera, because opera at its best is supposed to be a contemporary living theater that speaks to the audiences of its time. And in the past 20 years, because composers have gotten smarter, composers have gotten over the bad idea that you can either advance public taste or address the audience, but not both. So composers are writing better. Singers are singing brilliantly.
They're acting.
They're acting, exactly.
Singers are acting.
That's really what I meant. They're acting. The kind of vogue of the director's theater, which has been problematic in the short term, but it has built an audience for new ways of doing opera. All of these things are in place to start a kind of new flow of new work and new performance. And for the first time in a long time, the companies are listening, because the companies need us in a way that they haven't before.
Right.
Do you know? And so I really would like to think that the extraordinary good luck that I've had with Little Women and with Lysistrata so far, and other pieces that are looming, that it's not just my particular career, but that there's beginning to be a groundswell of new work and people who can do it.
Ideally, If you had your way, what would the balance be of old and new works at the Metropolitan Opera?
Well, can I answer that question with a little known historical fact? The season in which Traviata, you may have heard of it, that went up. Its premiere. It was the world premiere by Verdi. There were 2 or 3 other recent works by Verdi, and then there were another half a dozen pieces by contemporary Italian composers. But the press release that year was this novelty, this old piece that they were dusting off that hadn't been heard in 30 years, Bellini's Norma. That was the news of the season, a piece that was at the time maybe 40 years old, 30 years old, and was being presented as this antiquity. That's where we've come from. An overwhelmingly contemporary season, you know, in which the oldest piece was 40 years old. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think that if we aim for 65-35,
Right.
you know, 65, you know, 65% repertory pieces, because it's going to take a while. You know, that we have gone so far from the contemporary theater of Verdi and Wagner that it's going to take writers. You know, you can't all of a sudden add water stir and have a viable 20th century repertory, let alone a 21st. But I think little by little, if we got to 2/3 to 1/3, it would be a very, very interesting period in American opera.
Right. Having knocked off 2 hit operas,
Knocked off the sleep I lost.
what are you working on now?
Oh gosh. I have I'm doing my first orchestra piece for the National Symphony Orchestra. Harp Concerto goes up in '07, and I have some choral pieces that are happening. The new opera is going to be, drum roll, on Dracula for San Francisco Opera in 2009, if I finish it in time. So we should say 2011, really. No, I'm trying to be very good about that. It's a it's a grand scale piece. This is a big opera. This is because San Francisco is almost Met-sized, and David wants something of that sweep, which is good because it's the only really grand-scaled idea I have.
Are we going to see blood bags and
No, God forbid.
No blood bags?
No, I'll tell you, I resisted this piece for a while, and I'm not really at an outline, so you can't hold me to any of this. But I resisted it very strongly up front because I thought that this piece is like the original snuff film. You know, it's the original novel that kind of uses this mysterious supernatural character to justify a kind of all too common, you know, violence against and hatred of women to the extent that they, you know, represent sexuality. And so I kind of recoiled from that. And then it occurred to me that you could use this piece to write an opera about that very phenomenon. That if the real villains of the piece were, that if the vampire is a projection of these human beings who have incredible trouble with sexual repression, or in a certain way with a kind of honesty with themselves that includes sexual repression, but it includes, again, all the things that in the novel made me crazy, a kind of anti-Semitism, a kind of fear of foreigners, or that whole idea that you're afraid of something in yourself and so you get a scapegoat and then you put the stake through the heart of the scapegoat. If you could do an opera on that using the template of Dracula, you could do something very, very interesting. So that's where I think it's going at the moment. Wish me luck.
Have you written any of it? Words or music?
No, I'm in the outline phase.
You're in
This
the
is
outline
this is the
phase.
phase where I make all my producers really crazy because this is the phase that takes the longest because this is the most important. What's the piece about? How am I getting there?
Does it have a premiere date?
No. Again, David Gockley, who was the producer, who was my great advocate at Houston Grand Opera, and is now the intendant of San Francisco Opera, which is why it's a San Francisco Opera piece. He's being very patient with me. He would like it for 08, 09, but again, I don't want to commit to it until I know what I'm doing.
Right.
Here is where you live and die at this stage in the creative process. Do you know? I mean, all the rest is words and music, if you will. You know, it sounds a little glib, but you really need to know what it is and why it matters. And I feel like I will take as much time as I need to get that into an outline form, and then it will all come in.
Now, both your great mentors in this field have a change of career at the moment. The David Gockley has moved to the San Francisco Opera, and Paul
Kellogg
is leaving the New York City Opera.
I know.
This is an interesting moment for you too, then.
Yeah. Well, with City Opera, I'm sort of continuing it as composer in residence. I mean, I'll just miss. The nice thing is that Paul has become a friend, actually, as we've worked together over the years. And so, unless he gives up his apartment on 57th Street, I imagine we'll still be seeing each other. I don't know. I'm hoping that at this point, God willing, if everyone who is seeing the show comes to Lysistrata in March and makes it a hit, that with any luck there will be some interest in New York continuing, in my operatic work, and if Dracula A happens and B goes well, that maybe it will find a way to come to New York.
You also have at the New York City Opera a wonderful series called the Vox series.
Yes, I'd love to talk about that.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's the only series of its kind in the country.
And then we have to wrap it up.
Sure. But what we do is we read with voices and with orchestra segments of either new or unproduced opera by composers all around the country. We generally try to do a dozen people with Pulitzer Prizes, people that you've never heard of. It's a big festival.
When is that going
of new
to take
work.
place?
May 6 and May 7 at the Skirball Center at NYU, which is
and
the
you're
best
inviting
they've ever
everyone
had.
in our
Everyone.
studio.
It's free. It's a
audience.
Weekend thing. Go to City Opera. The information's on the website. It's really, really exciting. And it was exciting before I got there, but I like to think it's even more exciting now. We've got great pieces and a great team putting them together. So,
Mark, I'm sad to say that we have to stop here.
Oh, me too.
But alas, that's what they're telling me.
It's great to see you. Thank you for having me on.
It's been a great pleasure to reconnect with you today. Thank you, Mark Adamo, and our home and studio audiences for joining us today. And we hope to see you again soon for further conversations.